Hello, everybody. This is actually the third segment of a topic that we're doing, which I've entitled The Delicate Dance, Halacha and Human Nature. And that's dealing with the fact that, on the one hand, we're human beings with all kinds of impulses and urges that are natural and inherent in what it means to be a human being. On the other hand, the Torah makes demands of us to conform to behavior which is ethical and sacred, whether it's our obligations between us and other human beings, or obligations to Hashem, bein adam lechavero, bein adam lemakom. And so we're caught between these two demands. The way the Talmud puts it in a very nice play on Hebrew words, that we're caught between yitzri, my impulse, yetzer, right? Yitzri, my impulse, and yotzri, my creator, right? Those are these two contradictory impulses. And how do you navigate between these two elements? We're dealing with a specific aspect of that, and that is when we feel these impulses as a result of being human beings, and we don't necessarily act on it, but how do we relate to the fact that we've had these impulses? So we saw this surprising passage in the Tanya, in which the Baal Tanya explains that rather than being upset the fact that we have these impulses that that ask us to do things that we shouldn't be doing according to halacha, don't be upset by it. It doesn't reflect the fact that you're a horrible person. On the contrary, the fact that you didn't act on those impulses is something to celebrate. You should give yourself a big pat on the back. And the Baal Tanya explained that according to Kabbalah, in fact, the biggest praise we can give of Hashem is the fact that we have these impulses, which are inherent in being a normal human being, unless you happen to be an angel, and being able to say no, being able to suppress those instincts. And that's something to be thrilled about. And it's as if you performed a positive mitzvah. And you created, in fact, on a Kabbalistic level, a kind of suppression of the instinct towards evil in the entire cosmos. We're not going to explain exactly what that means, but sort of use your imagination. I guess you have to use your imagination to imagine such a thing, that the source of evil in the entire cosmos is reduced when we are able to suppress that evil instinct within ourselves. That's what the Baal Tanya explained. But then we saw last week something surprising. The Baal Tanya takes it one step further. And he says, just like it's true that one suppresses an evil instinct, that it has this incredibly powerful cosmic effect, that the source of evil is suppressed in the entire cosmos, that at the same time, even if one is able to suppress a natural instinct, which has nothing to do with anything evil, just natural, like you gave the example of appetite. So if a person goes to shul in the morning and comes home and wants to have a glot kosher breakfast, 100% kosher, there's no hint of anything evil there. You're just hungry, and you're going to eat a delicious, totally kosher meal. So the Baal Tanya said that it's advisable to suppress that instinct, at least temporarily. So instead of eating at 8:30 when you come back from Minyan, delay it till 9:30. Why? Because he claims that the same effect will take place, that the suppression of our internal natural instinct to want to eat creates a suppression in the world of a kind of animalistic drives in the world, in kind of the mystical cosmos. The same exact effect that he described when it came to suppressing an instinct towards doing something immoral or against Hashem's will. Yes, Bruce.
Is this removed? Is it objective and removed from the reality of which we live in? There's the Gemara story of Menashe. I think it's Menashe coming to Chezkiyahu. So if you would have been alive in my day, you'd have lifted up your toga and gone right after idols. But we don't have that type anymore. So is it an objective thing, good and evil, or is it just based on the context of the time and place in which you live, and then how you deal with it?
So I'm not sure I understand your question, because he's specifically right now talking about something which, I mean, halacha defines usually, something which is forbidden or permitted.
I mean, you mentioned food. You mentioned.
Yeah. So we're not talking
about.
You
mentioned food a lot, so.
Yeah, it's not a matter of cultural context or time or anything like that.
Well, if you live in a place where they eat 5 meals a day, if you lived in a place where they ate 5 meals a day, you might think that's normal. In another place where they ate 2 small meals a day, you'd look at that other system and say, wow, they are gluttonous. and the Torah says, do not be a glutton. So when you
Yeah,
come home and eat a lot, it may be that that is gluttonous, but in the world which you live in, it's perfectly normal.
yeah. So I think it's very clear from the way the Balatanya expressed it, because he actually uses the term afilu b'devarim hamutarim legamrei, even in a realm that is completely permitted. So he's not talking about gluttony at all, right? That's what's amazing about the Balatanya. He's talking about something, there's not a scintilla of any bad character traits or of gluttony. Now, by the way, I'm glad you mentioned that, because just as a footnote to our discussion, I want to mention there's a famous Ramban, which I think I might have briefly mentioned last week, where the Ramban says when the Torah says you shall be holy, that's actually what the Torah is talking about. It's talking about exercising self-restraint in the realm of the technically permissible, but primitive and base drives, like gluttony. So that we're not talking about just a natural and healthy meal, but gluttony. So even though there's no formal prohibition on gluttony, but it's a bad character trait. But the Balatanya is going way past that. And he's saying, like I said before, bidvarim hamutarim legamri, things that are utterly permitted, no scintilla of gluttony involved, the suppression of the natural instinct to eat, even though we're not involved in gluttony at all, that's good for the Jews. It's good for the world.
Again, I'm asking if that's a relative term. When you go to an Israeli breakfast in a hotel, to someone else who saw that,
Yes,
and when they come from it, that would look gluttonous. But we think it's normal.
So he's clearly not talking about that, because he says explicitly, where there's not a scintilla of any gluttony or bad midot ra'ot, of bad character traits. We're not talking about that. We're talking about that he's saying, and this is exactly the amazing idea here, that the suppression of a completely neutral instinct to eat, having nothing to do with gluttony or overeating or anything like that, that it's good to suppress it, because it has that same impact of suppressing the animal soul. Now, maybe we should take this one step deeper to explain what's going on. This will help us in understanding Rav Kook, which we started to contrast last week. You see, the Balatanya, based upon certain Kabbalistic theory, thinks that it's a very kind of dichotomous way of viewing how we operate. What do I mean by dichotomous? You either have a holy urge or a holy part of your being, or not. That's it. Holy or not. So we have a godly soul. So the godly soul is the holy part of us. And then we have a natural soul or an animal soul. In Tanya, the nefesh bahamit, the animal soul. The animal soul can express itself in multiple ways. It can express itself in a kosher way. It's an animal drive, but kosher. Or it can express itself in a prohibited way. It's an animal drive, which is expressing itself in a non-kosher way. But it's all the animal drive. That's why, if you understand that, we can understand the approach of the Balatanya. Because the suppression of even a natural and kosher drive to eat, not gluttonous, just to eat, right, in a way which is perfectly kosher, not exaggerated, etc. The fact is, it's part of our natural being, our animal soul, which is sometimes called the natural soul. I kind of like the term natural soul better. I don't like to look in the mirror and see an animal. So I like the term natural soul instead of animal soul, and he uses both. But since the animal soul is the animal soul, it's a natural soul, which can express itself sometimes in a permitted realm and sometimes in a forbidden realm, but it's the same natural soul. Right? It's what in Kabbalah is called klipa. Klipa literally means a peel. Right? It's like a banana has a peel. So the peel covers up the holiness, covers up the light. Right? So the Balatanya, according to his Kabbalistic theory, says, I'm sorry if this is a little bit Kabbalistic today, but whatever. Right? He says that the animal soul can express itself on two levels. One level is called klipat noga. So klipat noga means the shining shell or peel, meaning that it's natural, It's a peel, so it's covering up divinity, but it's not horribly covering it up. It shines. It's translucent. A little bit of divine sparks can radiate through it. And then there's what is in Tanya called the shalosh klipot tamot lagamre, the three completely impure klipot. That's when the animal soul expresses itself in something forbidden. But the point is, it's all klipa. It's all a realm of our being in which our divinity is concealed to one extent or the other. That's why the suppression of our inner klipa, right, that inner impulse, which is natural, even if it's not at all forbidden, is good, according to the Baal Tanya, because it's suppressing that that klipa part of us, that aspect, that animal soul, which covers the divine aspect, which is within us. So that's what the Baal Tanya said. And I'll just one more point on that, and Bruce, I'll get to you in a second. The Baal Tanya also added that if you do this, right, that not only do you suppress the cosmic source of klipa in the world, of concealment of God's presence, but that there's another effect, and that is that even though you're acting to suppress an instinct, not transform it. This is also, by the way, a very important idea in Chabad Chassidic, suppression versus transformation. Okay, so you're suppressing. A tzaddik has actually transformed his natural drives. A normal human being who's a good person, let's say, like Arthur, so he has suppressed his drive to go kill somebody on the highway, right? But it's still there. He just, whenever it pops his head up, he suppresses it. So you wouldn't, to look at him, you wouldn't think he's has murderous instincts and drives in him because he suppresses it. A tzaddik doesn't even have those drives. He's transformed those drives. So even though you were only engaged in suppression, which he advocates, right, even the realm of the principle, but the Baal Tanya explains that if we do that, do our part of suppressing, that Hashem may, in fact, reciprocate by sending us the inspiration and spiritual energy, which could actually perhaps lead us to the next stage, which would be transformation of those animal drives. So this is the this approach of the Baal Tanya, which is essentially advocating on a certain level, on a moderate level, asceticism, self-deprivation for its own sake, right? That has these sort of Kabbalistic effects on the cosmos and on us internally. Yes, we'll open up for any kind of questions or comments. Yes, Bruce.
There is an idea to enjoy what God provided us in this world that's completely kosher. But the question is, if there's bacon bits and that fish that tastes like shrimp, whether one could eat it because it's available, or should they eat it because it is available and we want to experience everything that God has provided us. So based on what you're saying, it sounds like although one could, maybe one shouldn't. Even though I thought, again, to experience everything God provided us, if you could, maybe you should. And I'm wondering if this is a question.
Yeah. Okay, it's a good question. I would say the following, that, he's advocating, that's why I use the term moderate self-denial. Right? So maybe the right way to say it was, go ahead and eat those bacon bits. It's kosher.
Kosher bacon bits.
It's not very good for you, but it's kosher. But you know what? Wait an hour. Right? Don't eat it right away. Okay. So
yeah,
I have a question, Jess.
Yeah, sure.
Hey, we talked. Last time we talked about what the people he only could put his body and head into the sukkah, but he can't put the rest of the body in. I mean, this is stupid. If you can't do it, then you build two or three people build a sukkah, and they have a sukkah. You don't do it when you put in a body you just build the sukkah you put in.
Yeah. Okay. So I actually think that you're remembering Rabbi Grunstein's shiur, and you're asking a question. So that wasn't me. That was Rabbi Grunstein. So Rabbi Grunstein just said he would be delighted if you give him a call or send him a message in WhatsApp or an email, and he'd be delighted to answer that question. Okay. So
Yeah,
The
I'm just wondering if you don't mind. I'm just wondering, why do you
sure.
need to suppress other things in order to accept what Hashem is sending us all the time? In other words, I understand the need to be able to plug into that good, to be able to plug into what Hashem is sending down to us, but I don't understand why you need to suppress I'll call it normalcy, so to speak, in order to accept that.
Yeah. So okay, I'm not 100% sure I understand your question. So let me start to answer it, and then you'll tell me if I'm way off.
Okay.
So I'm going to answer on two levels. He actually addresses it on a Kabbalistic level, because he's suggesting that that our animal soul is responsible for satisfying both our natural and healthy needs, as well as our inappropriate needs, things that are forbidden. It's the same animal soul. So without making it too Kabbalistic, right? So he's suggesting that, therefore, to the extent that we can get ourselves used to the habit of being able to control the animal within us, even though we're exercising that control in the realm of the permissible, where it's totally kosher, that's going to have the same effect and will be useful when we have drives coming from the same source, which are actually forbidden itself. Or to use an analogy which the Baal Tanya doesn't use, but I heard another rabbi use this analogy, and I like it a lot. He said, imagine, and Baal Tanya doesn't say this, but this is sort of psychologizing it, that imagine we have a just say no muscle. Okay, so that's called self-restraint. Right? So that's pretty hard for people living in the 21st century, because Nike says just do it. Right? And even if you somehow, I still don't think I'm living in the 21st century. Somehow my mind is. And I have a feeling that some of you have the same experience. We're still living in the 20th. Maybe some of you feel like you live in the 19th century. But in any case, even in the second half of the 20th century, the idea of like, I think because of perhaps, Dr. Spock, the very popular book that was in the 20th century of how to raise your children, which was, don't say no to them. It's going to make them neurotic. They'll have to spend the rest of their life on the psychiatrist's couch. So there was this like whole ethic of permissibility. And so this rabbi, I'll mention this, Rabbi Daniel Lapin, some of you may have heard of him. He's an excellent speaker. So he says that, we have a just say no muscle. It's the ability to say no to yourself, to your drives. But like any muscle, if you don't use it, it gets flabby and essentially useless. So you need to exercise it. So I'm using a completely different model, but to make the same point that Baal Tanya makes.
No, but I can understand exercising the muscle.
Hang on a second, let me just finish the point. So you caught it, but I'm not sure everybody else did. That therefore it's good to exercise that muscle, even though it's in the realm of the totally permissible, right? So I'm going to delay breakfast by an hour every day. Not because there's anything wrong at all. It's not gluttonous, because it builds up my just say no muscle, builds up my ability to say no to myself. And therefore, that's going to have the very good effect of when I'm really tempted by something that's actually not kosher, I will be able to have a well-honed just say no muscle. So that would be a non-Kabbalistic way of understanding, perhaps what the Baal Tanya, it says. But Baal Tanya explains it in Kabbalistic terms, not in that kind of naturalistic, educational, terms like just like.
I'm not truly satisfied with the answer, but that's okay.
Beseder, it's your right, though your world to come is in danger. So that's a joke. So now, last time we then contrasted this approach to the Baal Tanya with the approach of Rav Kook. And Rav Kook said something really fascinating. He was trying to explain, it's just a quick review, maybe not so quick. So Rav Kook was trying to explain a certain Gemara. There's a Mishnah that says that you shouldn't go to a barber when it's late in the afternoon, time to daven mincha, because you'll get distracted in getting your hair cut and you'll forget to daven mincha. Okay? So the Mishnah itself says that that's true. don't get your hair cut before you daven mincha. Right? It's a prohibition, a rabbinic prohibition. However, if you began the haircut, you don't have to stop. Go ahead and get your hair cut. Then just try to be diligent about finishing on time so you'll have time to daven mincha. So the Gemara asks, well, when is considered to be starting? Because it says if you started already the haircut, surprisingly, the Gemara doesn't say, well, that's defined by the guy taking clippers and cutting your hair. That's called starting the haircut. It actually says as soon as he puts the apron on you. Now, Arthur, I remember your point from last week, by the way, about the explanation. So it hasn't been lost on me. But Rav Kook then explains, why is it that it's considered to be starting the haircut merely just putting the apron on? He gives the following explanation. He says, and he goes back to our issue here, we have demands made upon us by our natural self. We have demands made upon us by our Creator. And Rav Kook claims that Hashem, in his demands made upon us, is very careful not to overly suppress our natural drives. Our natural drives are very, very important and positive. Now, I'm going to see, this is quite a different approach here, and I'll explain today, as soon as I finish the review, why it's positive. He has really fascinating to say about this, Rav Kook. So, on the other hand, we have an obligation to live a moral life and a spiritual life. So, whenever the Torah imposes a prohibition, it does so in a way which is finely calibrated balance between God's demands and our natural demands. Okay? So Rav Kook goes further and he says that when the rabbis made prohibitions, they used that paradigm of very carefully balancing, calibrating natural demands, which are essentially good, and demands of morality, spirituality, etc., which are also good. So we don't want to overly suppress our natural demands. So he says the following, that when you are about to go get a haircut and you're walking towards the door of the barbershop, and then all of a sudden you remember the Mishnah. The Mishnah says, daven first, don't get your haircut. So you say, oi, okay, you leave, right? You didn't even open the door yet, right? You leave, go to the parking lot, you go to the Young Israel of Century City in Los Angeles, and you daven mikveh. Okay? So yeah, fine, that's the halacha. Now, Rav Kook says, let's take a different scenario. You open the door of the barbershop, you walked in, you sat down, you have to wait a few minutes before the chair opens up. You're getting excited about getting a little bit of attention from your barber therapist. And you sit in the chair, the barber puts the apron around you, you settle in for this, getting 20 minutes of attention, which we don't get from our wives. And now he hasn't even started to cut the hair, and then you remember, oi, I didn't daven mincha yet. Well, and I remember that the Mishnah says, but I've already began the haircut, I can go ahead and finish. And the Gemara explains that's even if just the apron was put on me. And lo and behold, the apron's putting on me. Now, why is that? So Rav Kook explains, because psychologically, and the rabbis were great psychologists, they were very attuned to the fact that once we have that apron on, we are psychologically engaged. We're in the haircut frame of mind. And therefore, to ask us to take off the apron and go outside and daven is already a demand which is not preserving the careful balance and calibration between our natural instincts and inclinations on the one hand, and the demands of halacha. That would be overly oppressive and suppressive. So therefore, that's why the halacha is that merely putting the apron on, you're considered to have started your haircut and you can go ahead and finish it, because to demand to disengage at that point would be overly heavy suppression of our kind of natural inclinations as human beings. That was Rav Kook's explanation. And he used this fantastic expression, Ki ra'ui lechabed gam et hanitiyah hativit shel adam. It's fit to honor the natural inclinations of a person, unless there is an overwhelming spiritual or ethical demand. So that was Rav Kook from last week. So we see here something, it seems to be a pretty radical contrast between how we view these natural drives. Do we honor them and make sure we don't engage in suppression of them unless it's really demanded objectively by the demands of ethical issues or spiritual issues. Whereas the Baal Tanya said, suppress it. It's good for you. To use the expression we use now, which the Baal Tanya doesn't use, it will develop your just say no muscle. Or using the Baal Tanya's explanation, it will suppress the drives of evil in the entire cosmos, and will even give you a kind of inspiration from heaven, which may even allow you to eventually transform your inner drives rather than just suppressing and controlling them. So this was where we left off last week, with this really interesting contrast between the Baal Tanya and Rav Kook on how to understand these two different drives of my creator versus my natural drives. Okay, now, any comments or questions before we move on?
You can go either way with this, I imagine. There's no halachic nafkamina, or do you think it's actually
because it's not in the realm of it's not in the realm of it's a good question. It's not in the realm of halacha. That's exactly my point. Why this is so interesting, because the Baal Tanya said explicitly, we're talking about the realm of the completely permissible, no gluttony involved whatsoever. That it's a good Hasidic practice,
right?
Which in Baal Tanya is not addressing a card-carrying Chassid. We're all card-carrying Chassidim in our souls. We're all Lubavitchers, obviously. So therefore, right? So it has no halachic implication. It's just a question of avodat Hashem, how best to serve Hashem.
I never associate Hasidut with the type of piety that's connected to asceticism. In fact, I associate with the opposite.
Boker Tov. Yeah, Boker Tov. So now I use the term moderate right before moderate asceticism because, let's not exaggerate. He's not talking about sleep on a bed of nails or this is not. It means like delaying breakfast for an hour, right? So that's. For me, that would be like sleeping on a bed of nails, but for most people, that's probably a moderate demand. Any other questions or comments before we move on?
Yeah, I'm just wondering. I'm just wondering. If we go back to brachot, I think it's 30. You talk about you need preparation for tefillah, and are we to daven then if we don't prepare? I mean, I'm just thinking like here it's it's time for mincha, and suddenly, and you're not preparing, you're not getting ready. You're thinking about getting your hair cut, or you're thinking about your regular or whatever it might be, and instead we rush into it. And mincha is one of those tefillot, which because it's the middle of the day, we sort of do that. But
I mean, I guess you're asking a practical question. Or make perhaps maybe an observation. That is, you're about to go get your hair cut. You go to open the door of the barber shop, and then you realize, oi, I should have done mincha. So you quickly run to Young Israel Century City, led by the esteemed Rabbi Muskin, the excellent rabbi. You heard that, Rabbi Muskin? So, and your point is, like, what kind of mincha is that going to be? You're like rushing up. So, just on a tachlis, the way we hold nowadays is that, what may have been 2,000 years ago in terms of like, you have to be in a proper frame of mind. Obviously, it'd be better to have spent 10 minutes learning Tanya before davening mincha, so you'll be in a proper frame of mind. But, we hold just do it in terms of mincha. It may not be the most inspiring mincha that you've ever davened. Okay. So, by the way, I once I heard a statement from one of the great Torah scholars of the first half of the 20th century, who said he was describing what Rav Kook was like. And so this great Torah scholar is very famous, though I can't remember his name right now, which one it was, but someone super famous. He said that I wish that my ne'ilah was on the level of Rav Kook's regular day mincha. That's a total side point. Okay, what I want to do now is try to understand on a deeper level Rav Kook's approach. Okay, So if you take a look at source number 5, we're going to more deeply, we try to explain the Baal HaTanya's approach that he holds that the animal soul is responsible for both neutral behavior and immoral behavior. It's the same soul, it's different aspects of it. So therefore, the suppression of the animal soul is good because for all the reasons we said before, because they're essentially the same. It's animal drive. In one case, it's for neutral activity like eating. In the other case, it's immoral activity, like eating something not kosher. Okay, for the sake of that example. But Rav Kook, what's Rav Kook about? What's this idea of honoring? He said explicitly, we have to honor hanitiyah hativit, the natural. Why honor it? Why not slice it up? It gives us a lot of grief. So let's learn source number 5. He says it's impossible to understand the wondrousness of the human will, ratzon, human will. Now, that Hebrew word ratzon, human will, if I were to take the same word but make it into a verb instead of a noun, rotzeh. What does the word rotzeh mean? To desire. That's a very important thing to note at this point, right? That the ratzon, will, and desire are the same thing. Bechol pe'er chosho, to understand human ratzon, this will, in all of its beautiful freedom. Rak betor nitzutz echad me hashalhevet hagdola shel ratzon hagadol shebechol havaya kula. That it's impossible to understand the wondrousness of the ratzon as being other than a spark, this is extremely important, that comes from the great flame of the great ratzon, the great will, which is in all of existence. Now, what is that great will which is in all of existence? Hofa'at ritzon ribon kol halomim. It is the phenomenon of the will of the master of all worlds, Baruch Hu may be blessed. Okay, now, let's talk about this. So, if you take a look at your source sheets here, so I hope you have them with you. So the last page, I sent a diagram. This is the diagram of the Sfirot. So we have to get Kabbalistic. By the way, what makes this comparison and contrast between Rav Kook and the Baal HaTanya even more interesting is they're both based upon Kabbalah. As a matter of fact, Rav Kook had a very strong Chabad Chassidic tendency. And I think I might have mentioned this in the past. His mother came from a Chabad home, right? And he himself learned Tanya. He taught Tanya when he lived in Yaffo, which is where he first lived for the first 10 years of after coming to Eretz Israel. He used to give a Farbrengen, as if he was a Lubavitcher Rebbe, that it was in the same style, with the same language. All the Chabad Chassidim in Yaffo would come to him. So this was a world he was very familiar with and it was very influenced by. But in this particular aspect, there seems to be, he charted his own path. Now, why did I give you this chart of the Sfirot? Sfirot are the way Hashem expresses himself through creation. The modalities that Hashem uses in order to create. So we can't go into a detailed discussion of what that all means. But it's interesting to note that the way, if you've heard of the idea of Sfirot, so you probably have heard of them in the context of Chabad, because that word Chabad, as I'm sure most of you know, is an acronym for Chokhmah, Bina, and Dat, which are these three intellectual Sfirot. Just like we express ourselves through Chokhmah and Bina and Dat, without describing what those things mean right now, so too God expresses himself through Chokhmah, Bina, and Dat. And when we say God expresses himself, we mean that he creates. Being creative is self-expression, right? So when God expresses himself in these different modalities of Chokhmah, Bina, Dat, and the other 7 Sfirot, or 10, so that is what brings into being the world. And all the things that exist in the world are a function of the way the different sfirot, the different creative expressions of God, the different creative modalities interact with each other. And you could even, if you were a great scientific Kabbalist, you could do the following. You could say that Arthur, I was able to see into his soul, he's a combination of 3 parts Bina, 1 part Chokhmah, and 4 parts Malchut. And you could come up with a kind of chemical atomic formula, as it were, describing how the Sfirot interacted in order to create the uniqueness of Arthur. Now, this chart I sent out has something interesting to it, because of our exposure to Chabad, we tend to think of Chokhmah, which is the Chet from Chabad, as the highest Sfirah. So, translated wisdom, even though that's not very descriptive of what it really is. But actually, if you look at this chart, if you have it in front of you, so the highest Sfirah is not Chokhmah, it's Keter. Keter. Keter means crown. So Chokhmah, Bina, and Dat are things that describe what goes on inside your brain, or God's brain, as it were. Okay? A Keter, a crown, sits on top of your head, right? It's above intellect. When we ask ourselves, why does God do something? Our ability to answer that question, the why questions, as important as they are to us, the truth of the matter is, the real answer, as unsatisfying as it may be, is because he wanted to. Now, that's not, and my parents used to say this to me, why? Because I asked you. It's like not very satisfying for an adolescent. And it's not very satisfying for us to say that why did God create human beings? Why did God create the world? The answer is he wanted to. Ratzon. And Ratzon is above intellect, right? Keter is Ratzon. That's what Keter is. Ratzon, will. What's a king? Crown. It's somebody who has the ability to express their will and have their will complied with. That's what makes you a king, right? If I put on royal robes and sit on a throne and make all these pronouncements about what should be, but nobody listens to me, which is about the reality of my life within the context of my family. So, right, what kind of king am I? I'm a king in my own eyes, but that's not a king, right? So God, right, he's the Melech Malchei Amlachim, he's the king of kings. So Keter represents this idea that he is able to express his will. Hu Amar Vayehi, God speaks, and it is, right? That's the essence of what makes God a Melech. Rosh Hashanah coming up very soon is the idea for us recognizing Hashem's Malchut, his kingship. Okay. Keter is Ratzon, right? The divine will, inscrutable by definition. It's above the head, inscrutable. Okay. Now, Rav Kook is saying something amazing. Instead of saying that our Ratzon, not God's, our personal Ratzon, well, you know what that is? That's the animal drives within us, right? So the way Rav Kook understands on a fundamental level is our Ratzon is a spark of the divine Ratzon, the highest, most inscrutable aspect of God, the most powerful aspect of God. It's that inscrutable desire, will that God had to create, and as soon as that will of God is expressed, existence comes into being. We are the same way, Rav Kook says, that the human being, that anything we do in the world is because of our internal Ratzon. Now, Ratzon, as Rav Kook, and I think we'll have to sort of play it by ear because I do want to finish this topic today, so I may do more paraphrasing of Rav Kook than reading the text inside. Or maybe I'll just read the English translation here. That Rav Kook claims that our special quality of Ratzon is derivative of the divine Ratzon. By the way, that's also true with all the other aspects of our personality, because just like God has all of these sfirot through which he expresses himself and creates, Chochmah Bina Dat, Chesed Gvur Tiferet, Netzach Yesod Malchut, all those sfirot, we have within us also Chochmah Bina Dat, right? All of those different sfirot, and we express ourselves through those. So just like God has Ratzon, we have Ratzon, and our Ratzon is derived from the divine Ratzon. That Ratzon is the most powerful and fundamental and inscrutable aspect of our own being. It is what allows us to act in the world. I like to compare it to an engine. It's like our motor. Think of the famous quote from Herzl: "If you will it, it is not a dream." There's something about will, ratzon, which is this incredibly powerful force within us that can move mountains. I mean, literally. I mean, it's amazing when you think about people who are movers and shakers in the world. People who are not couch potatoes, right? But people who have created huge differences in the way the world is. And let's give positive examples of that, right? Let's say, let's get close to home for a second. Rabbi Riskin. You know, there's just a little Jew. He happens to be, with all due respect, he's little, right? He's short. And this little Jew, right, has created, I mean, he's very responsible for Efrat, its existence. He's created all these educational institutions. He has thousands of people whose souls he's touched who became religious through him. I mean, it's amazing. This one little Jew, right? How? Indomitable ratzon. Now, I worked for Rabbi Riskin. Bruce remembers that for 5 years. Rabbi Riskin is like think of a flame, you know, a motor like a car. There's combustion. There's combustion in that little Jew. That combustion is indomitable and can move mountains. And to build that right, you have to move mountains. You have to to build on those hills. You have to move mountains. And one thing I noticed about Rabbi Riskin, which was an amazing quality, which I wish I had, because of the power of his ratzon, even when he was defeated, you know, we see his success stories, but I was on the inside for a few years. For every 100 projects that he takes on, right? So let's say that 30 of them succeed, 70 of them don't. Some of you may have been entrepreneurs, by the way, in your previous lives. Bruce was an entrepreneur, I know that. It's the quality of an entrepreneur. Rabbi Riskin is a Torah entrepreneur. It's ratzon. It's that fire, that combustion. And it's an amazing thing. When Rabbi Riskin, and I can tell you an amazing story, I won't do it right now, another time, and not while being recorded, of something I participated in personally, which was unbelievable story. If you give me a couple of l'chaims, I'll tell you the whole story. Amazing story. That when Rabbi Riskin was, you know, something didn't work out, you know what he did? He just got up and moved on. Just kept moving. In contrast to a non-entrepreneur like myself, who the first time you get knocked down, you say, okay, I'm a loser. That's it. Give up, find another profession. Right? That's why Rav Kook talks about the pli'ah, the wondrousness of ratzon. That ratzon is this capability of keep moving and not to be deterred by those mountains in your way. Ratzon is what allows us to transform the world. It's this engine, this combustion engine, right? And our ratzon, the reason it's so critical and powerful is because it's a spark from the divine ratzon, the very essence, the highest expression of divinity, which is keter, the crown, right? Will, indomitable will. Rav Kook also used the term chofish, freedom. See, because ratzon also is our freedom. What does that mean? How is it that I am able to act in a way which is refined and noble in spite of things which are obstacles? They may be external obstacles. They may be internal obstacles. I have the ability to choose a path, to desire a path and follow that path independent of obstacles. Again, whether external or internal. That's called freedom. That's called autonomy. What drives that? Ratzon. Ratzon. right? My ratzon, in its most sublime aspect, is the ability to be able to overcome these obstacles. That's called freedom. I'm not imprisoned. Because if you don't exercise ratzon, right, then we're just trapped by circumstances, external circumstances, or internal circumstances. That's being a prisoner. Okay, so let's go back to that text of, and I think because of the fact that I do want to finish today, we'll read it just in English, that source number 5. Okay, so we'll go from where we left off. When the will is sanctified, ratzon, the branch is similar to its great root. Like when we are able to take that ratzon and use it properly, then that spark of the divine ratzon is like divinity, right? It's nourished from it, attached to it, and is filled with abundance of life from its light, the divine light. It is filled with eternal and perfect content. This, if you ever learned Rav Kook before, this sounds like Rav Kook, right? These like highfalutin and beautiful words. But when the individual will of man is uprooted through immersion in smallness and fracture of the divisive captivity within which it is imprisoned, attaches his will from its source of life. So that's hard language, but Rav Kook is saying the following. The problem is that, and this is where it becomes a little similar to the way the Baal HaTanya said it, and perhaps this is how Rav Kook understood on some deeper level the approach to Baal HaTanya. That will, that combustion, that engine we have, just like all combustion, all like fire in California now, it can be incredibly destructive, right? So it has to be used properly, right? So when it's used properly, it's expressing its authentic root, which is in the divine. But if we detach it from the connection to the divine, then it just becomes crazy fire with all the destructive implications of that. And then he goes on, I'm just skipping a little bit. The entire labor of character improvement and of all spiritual phenomenon in the world, what does it mean to avodat Hashem, to do tshuva, to grow, is focused on the supernal goal of the redemption of the will and its return to its fundamental source of life. Meaning, what are we trying to do right now? Elul, Rosh Hashanah, Aseret Yemei Tshuva, is to try to make sure that our personal will is attached to its natural root, which is the divine will. Because as soon as it becomes detached, then it's fire in a destructive sense. So tshuva, refinement, growth, means to make sure that this wonderful thing called ratzon that we have within us, which is a spark of the divine ratzon, is properly connected to its source in the divinity. And then he uses this really beautiful language here, right? To make sure it's attached to its source. And look at this language, really beautiful. That it be planted in the house of the Lord, our ratzon, to bear branches and fruit, to produce buds and flowers and an abundant yield, to be united in a perfect and living unity with the truth of the universal will, which is the light of God and his glory that resides within the soul of all existence. Yeah, beautiful language. That's the great, amazing effect and power of the will when it's rooted in its authentic source, which is the divine will. Okay. Now, this will be our home stretch now. So Rav Kook now, this is from a different book of Rav Kook. We're putting these selections all together to try to make a coherent understanding of Rav Kook's approach. We'll understand now why Rav Kook said we have to honor the will. The will is your God-given engine. It's the combustion engine which allows us to function in the world and move mountains. Imagine that you're tired of spending all your money getting your car fixed at Musach Hagush, as wonderful as that place is. You're going to fix your own car if you're brave enough. So you start to fool around with it. You have to be really careful when you start to fool around with the engine, right? Instead of tweaking the engine so it improves and works better, what if you ruin the engine? Your car ain't going nowhere now. That's a very concrete analogy to what Rav Kook is saying. that we have to be very careful not to harm our combustion engine. Because if we mistakenly think that spiritual growth involves suppression to our combustion engine, so to use the Hebrew expression, Yotzei Scharo Behefsedo, that any profit is lost in the loss, right? That you tried to fix things and you ended up destroying things because you've harmed that engine that you have, which is the very source of your ability to be free and achieve the divine agenda for which you were created in the world, to impact upon the world, to move those mountains. So watch this last source here. Tshuva preceded the world, source number 6, and it is therefore the foundation of the world. The wholeness of life is particularly through the continuation of the revelation of life in accordance with its essential nature. Rav Kook says there's also a divine combustion engine which is in the whole world. It's that divine ratzon coming from the divine keter, divine crown, which is the engine. It's the power. It's the life force which moves everything forward. And it's good. Since nature in itself is not capable of examination and discernment, sin is inevitable, right? It's inevitable that we're going to make mistakes. It's inevitable that that combustion within us will sometimes become detached from its divine root, and we'll end up doing something with it which was not positive, which was immoral. So sin is inevitable. Now, but watch what he says here. There's no righteous person in the world that does only good and never sins, other than Alex. But the negation of the essence of the naturalness of life in order that man not sin is itself the biggest sin. I'll read that again. The negation of the essence of the naturalness of life in order that man not sin is itself the biggest sin. He's saying the following. I don't want to sin. I want to be a good Jew. So what am I going to do? What drove me to sin? My desire, my ratzon. So I'm going to suppress ratzon. I'm going to beat myself up. I'm going to suppress my ratzon so that I'm not led to sin. So Rav Kook says this amazing thing, that the negation of the naturalness of life, ratzon, or to put it in Chabad terms, the natural soul, the negation of the naturalness of life in order that I won't sin, that's the biggest sin. That's like trying to fix your engine of your car, giving a tune-up and destroying the combustion engine. That was much worse than the fact that it needed a tune-up. In a misguided attempt at tuning it, you destroyed the engine altogether. And then he quotes from a source that you're probably familiar with. Just hang on one second here, which is, I think someone mentioned this before, the Nazir, the Nazarite. According to many opinions, including in the Gemara, you have to bring a sin offering after being a Nazarite. Nazarite voluntarily takes on prohibitions which are not at all prohibited. Wine, getting a haircut, nothing wrong with those things, unless it's adjacent to mincha, and you already have the robe on you, so the apron. So Rav Kook says that's why he has to bring a sin offering, because the Nazir is tampering with the combustion engine. When you tamper with that combustion engine, you're playing with fire, right? And you're doing it in a way which is going to run the risk of extinguishing that fire. You extinguish that fire, that flame in you, then you're a shmata. You're a gornish. You're a nothing, right? You have undermined the power that God has given you to act profoundly and effectively in the world, that combustion engine. So let's just read on, and then we'll open up for questions and comments. Tshuva, therefore, repairs the defect.
How do you feel?
Okay, I'm sorry.
Pretty sore.
Bruce, you said something? It looks like you're talking to somebody. Okay, Tshuva, therefore, repairs the defect and returns the world and life to its source, particularly by revealing the supernal root of its essence, the world of freedom. For this reason, God is called Elohim Chaim, the God of life, life force, affirmation of life force. Tshuva is not to damage the combustion engine. Tshuva is to realign the combustion engine with its authentic source in the divine combustion engine, which is Ratzon, Keter. Therefore, tshuva has to be done in a very careful way, that we realign ourselves with our authentic source, that our Ratzon being a spark in the flame of the divine Ratzon, but not to damage the Ratzon, because that would be, in fact, the greatest sin, as Rav Kook stated. Now we can really understand his original, the text that we saw, and that is why all halachot are carefully calibrated, that we not suppress natural instincts, because natural instincts are, in fact, the engine. It's the Ratzon. It's that most fundamental, most noble part of the human being. It's the divine part of the human being, which empowers us to act in the world and transform the world. I'll just end with this one last point I wanted to make, and then we'll open it up for a couple, like 1 minute of questions. We're about to assert Yemei Tshuva. We say, Zachrenu l'chaim melech hafetz b'chaim. Remember us for life, O sovereign who desires life, and inscribe us in the book of life for your sake, O God of life. And Rav Kook is saying that the affirmation of life that we say in this one line of the davening is this notion of the affirmation of the centrality, the absolute importance of that combustion engine, that life force, that natural aspect of being, which is nothing other than a spark within us of the divine life force. God is a God of life, not the negation of life. Okay, we have about 1.5 minutes for any kind of questions or comments. Any questions or comments on what we said?
Hold on. Yeah, I had a question for you.
Yeah, go ahead.
We're discussing everything in the context of Ratzon, but I thought in a world where most people are Tinuk Shenishba, they're not really responsible, and they're peer pressure, there's issues. They're not really doing things like out of a Ratzon that they want to experience whatever they want to experience. Where do those people fall into this?
So are you talking about people who have used the Ratzon for destructive behaviors?
No, they just act in a certain way because they don't really know there's any issue here. They live in a world of peer pressure. They don't know what's good and wrong in terms of Halacha or Judaism.
Yeah, okay, so
it's not like they're choosing a murder or not.
That's part, okay, so that's what it means to learn Torah. Part of learning Torah is that's we talked about the whole idea of tshuva and of avodat Hashem, is to be able to align one's Ratzon with the divine Ratzon, which is actually its natural connection. It's not unnatural. It's, according to Rav Kook, that's its natural source.
But are they responsible? They don't even know there's a Torah to learn.
Yeah, God's very forgiving. But the real answer to your question is, that's what learning is about, to be able to know how to align the personal Ratzon with the divine Ratzon. With that, I want to wish everybody a wonderful last sprint of Elul, in which we can honor our natural drives in the way Rav Kook mentioned it, and be able to align that with the divine Ratzon permeating all of existence.
Are we seeing you next week?
I look forward to it. And